Cat's Cradle Chapter Summary. This chapter contains explicit content and sloppy makeouts. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Okay, I'm ready. The moment the words left her lips, Marinette was indeed ready. Her mind raced, wondering what was going to happen next. In her experience, sex followed a natural progression. Makeouts led to heavy petting, led to clothes being shucked and piled on the floor, which led to the bedroom or the couch or the floor of the bathroom. She wanted to slide into Adrian's lap, feel his hands slide up her back, tangle her fingers in his hair and savor the taste of his mouth on hers. And she might just do that if this evening went to plan and she was in a position to dictate the course of an evening. But for now she waited to see what Adrian would say or have her do. For now he watched her, gaze drifting up and down her frame with a curious, almost appraising look in his eye that took Marinette a moment to place because she was more used to it coming from losers at bars than from someone she was interested in. Adrian was blatantly checking her out. "Did you make that dress?" Adrian asked, leaning back on the couch with a thoughtful look. "I've been wanting to ask all night." "Yes and no," Marinette said, smoothing her skirt out as she looked down at herself, surprised that that was the first thing Adrian decided to ask of her. "The dress itself is from a shop. I sewed the bow on myself." "The dress was nice before, but it was lacking something. A personal touch," Adrian said. "Something like that," Marinette shrugged, stomach fluttering as Adrian bit his lip almost thoughtfully. "Clever," Adrian said, lazily draping a hand over the back of the couch as he continued to look her over with a smile gracing his lips. "Is this how all kinky affairs start?" Marinette asked, raising an eyebrow. "By complimenting each other's choice in clothing." "No," Adrian shrugged. "But then again, most of my affairs haven't been with people with your taste in clothing." "And I thought clothes were just a hindrance," Marinette said with a small smile. "You clearly put together this outfit with some thought, so I wanted to appreciate it before," Adrian said, letting the implication hang in the air between them. He watched her throat bob as she swallowed, lips parting and looking across the couch at him with an expectant hunger that made the hairs on the back of his neck to stand up. "Can I ask why?" "Why?" Marinette said with a frown. "You must have dozens of dresses," Adrian said, turning to face her completely as he tapped his cheek with the tip of his index finger. "And of all the dresses you own, you show up with the one with the bow on your back. Why? Why do you think?" Marinette asked, sitting up with a coy smile that clashed with the heat rising in her cheeks. "I seem to remember there being some talk about unwrapping on Tuesday." "And so you gift wrapped yourself," Adrian said. "How thoughtful." "Besides," Marinette said, nylon-covered legs rubbing together as she glanced away shyly, "I had to make sure the dress matched the rest of my outfit." The rest of Adrian's eyes widened with realization. The rest of the outfit. I should have known you would match top to bottom." "Well, I wanted tonight to be special," Marinette said, fingers along the edge of her skirt. "I'm glad I'm not the only one," Adrian said, loosening his collar a little as he slowly felt his nerve build up. Some people could switch on their dominant side like turning on a light. Adrian's dominant side was like a late-model Soviet Union-designed hatchback and as such needed a few minutes to get started. It had been easier over the phone when Marinette wasn't kneeling on the couch 2 feet away from him, watching him with barely veiled anticipation glittering in her eyes. Adrian held on to the look in her eye as a source of strength. If she believed that he was capable of satisfying her curiosity among other things, then he had to be. "So you seem to know a lot about my history with this," Adrian said. "And I realize that I'm at something of a disadvantage since I don't know yours." "This is my history," Marinette picked at a loose thread on the throw blanket. "I haven't done anything with anyone else, don't even know what to do, or you don't have to," Adrian said, drawing her gaze from the blanket back to his piercing, hungry expression. "That's the beauty of your particular role tonight, worrying about what to do is my job." "I know," Marinette said, gaze drifting down again. But a soft touch cupped her under her chin, tilting her head back up until her eyes locked with Adrian's again. Color flooded her cheeks as Adrian tilted his head and looked at her curiously. "You have pretty eyes," Adrian said in the same low purring voice she had last heard Tuesday over the phone. "Why, you too," Marinette said, suddenly at a loss for anything more eloquent to say. Her face flushed as his glittering green eyes glinted in the low light of the living room, her natural inclination to glance away until her nerves returned to her. But she couldn't. The soft pressure of Adrian's fingers under her chin forced her gaze up to meet his. "And yet you keep looking away," Adrian said, "D.W.H. I don't know," Marinette mumbled, licking her lips. "What did I say about being honest?" Adrian laughed, slowly rising from the couch and drawing Marinette's gaze with the tips of his fingers as he moved in front of her. He could feel her heartbeat pulse through her skin, hammering harder and harder as she twisted to match his movements. In a moment, he was standing in front of the couch, fingers tilting, her eyes up to look at him as she leaned back against the sofa, feet on the ground, knees slightly spread and fingernails idly scratching the cushions beneath her. "You can do better than that, princess." Something about the way the word rolled off his tongue robbed Marinette of her ability to breathe for a split second. Her rational brain wanted to pick apart why a touch and a word felt so arousing, but her rational brain had apparently taken the night off. Something about Adrian's posture, his expression, his manner of speaking, and that insufferably sexy smile of his projected an aura that was at once indifferent and intensely interested, as though he wanted her but would be just as fine if he didn't get what he wanted. I guess I'm just a little embarrassed," Marinette murmured, eyes flicking down for a split second before bouncing back to Adrian's. "Why?" Adrian asked, drawing an exasperated snort from Marinette. "First time jade jitters like you said," Marinette said, wanting with all her heart to reach up and pull him down onto the couch with her. "I see," Adrian said in a way that suggested that he was satisfied with the answer while at the same time knowing it wasn't the complete answer. "Well, in spite of that, I would like you to look at me when you talk to me so I can see those pretty blue eyes of yours. Does that sound like something you can manage?" I think so," Marinette stammered as Adrian leaned forward at his waist, face now inches away from hers and smiling in a way that rooted her to the couch. "I think you're more than up to the task," Adrian said, tracing his thumb along her jawline idly. "Don't you?" "Yes," Marinette said softly, lips parting and accidentally brushing against his thumb. She noticed his pupils dilating, a small intake of breath, but otherwise he seemed so impassive, so secure. He had made himself a fixed point in the sea of hormones that threatened to overwhelm them, a safe harbor to dock herself in. "Do you want me to teach you tonight?" Adrian asked softly. "Yes," Marinette said, whining slightly as her hips rocked unconsciously against the open air. "Are you going to play along with me tonight?" Adrian asked, trailing his hand down her jaw and idly fingering the choker at her throat. "Why yes," Marinette said, throat bobbing against his gentle touch. He leaned forward onto the couch, one knee planting between her open legs and his free hand supporting his body as he leaned in closer. She could practically taste the fresh, minty scent of his toothpaste on his breath, and if her lips twitched the slightest fraction of an inch, they might have met his. But her gaze did not waver, she was almost afraid to blink in case the night vanished like a mirage in the desert heat. "Are you going to be a good girl for me tonight?" Adrian murmured, words thrumming into the center of her being as she nodded almost instinctively. "Yes," she whispered, lips parting in a way that made Adrian want to kiss them, hard and fast until they were pink and stripped of the glossy sheen of her lip gloss. "I can't," Adrian reminded himself. "If I kiss her I'm completely screwed, this is just supposed to be sex, I can't please," Marinette panted, eyes shimmering and chest slowly rising and falling beneath him. "Please teach me, sir. Fuck it." For the briefest hair of a second, Marinette wondered if she had said the wrong thing because Adrian's eyes widened, his lips parted, and he let out a small strangled sound in his throat. She had just wanted to rise to the occasion, fit him with a nickname that matched the regal pet name he had bestowed on her. But any doubts she had about her actions were short-lived and banished by the sensation of Adrian's lips on her own. She let out a small whimper as her head pressed against the back of the couch, cupped by his hand no longer lingering on her jaw as her eyes went wide while her mind tried to process the sudden turn of events. So far her brain had arrived at the following conclusions. 1. Adrian's mouthwash was sharp, minty, and made Marinette's lips tingle even after he used it. 2. The couch's cushions were deep enough to drown in which she just might if Adrian pushed her into it any more. 3. Holy fuck, holy fuck, holy fuck, she was kissing Adrian aggressed. The last realization was the most pressing as Adrian's mouth continued to press against hers, smothering the small moan that escaped her throat. She had fantasized about this moment since she was 14 years old, but in all her wildest fantasies, her first kiss with Adrian was never as electrifying as this was. His lips moved with a hungry insistence as though he had only one chance to kiss her for the rest of his life and he wanted to make the most of it before he came up for air. It was a commanding, sensual kiss that pried her lips open for exploration, tongue passing over hers as he deepened the kiss even further. Her hands pressed against his chest until his fingers reached down to tangle with hers, bringing her hands up and pressing them against the cushion on either side of her head. Marinette's legs spread further, whimpering into his mouth as the kiss left one word flashing over and over again in Marinette's subconscious. Mine. It was less of a kiss and more of a mark of claim. It was his way of dispelling any doubts she might have had that he wanted her, that his insistent questioning had been a product of reluctance on his part instead of a means of ensuring that he had complete consent from her. Now that he had it, he was going to put it to good use. One searing, blistering kiss was all it would take to immolate the parched fragments of their friendship, and out of the ashes, something more intimate would emerge. Adrian didn't care that this wasn't going to end in romance. He didn't care that she was going to just be a friend outside the bedroom. He didn't care about anything other than her lips on his, her tongue in his mouth, her soft, needy moans vibrating in her throat as he continued to kiss her. When Adrian pulled back, Marinette gasped as though she had just come up from the depths of the ocean. She panted heavily, eyes half-lidded and chest heaving as Adrian hovered over her, licking his lips with a thoughtful smack. "Hem, Peach," Adrian said, glancing down at Marinette with a predatory grin. "You taste good, Princess Tilda." Marinette let out an airy laugh, fingers twining with his as he continued to hold her lightly against the cushions. She looked up at him as his gaze drifted down to her chest heaving in her dress, arching her back a little bit to give him a closer view. "See something you like, sir?" Marinette asked a little shyly, feeling herself slipping more comfortably into her role as Adrian laughed, slowly backing up and standing while tugging her to her feet. She wobbled on her heels for a moment, falling forward and bumping into his chest as his arms stabilized her. "Mind the step," Adrian chuckled, hands drifting down to the bow on Marinette's back. "Thanks," Marinette said, chin pressed against his chest and looking up at him as a small, giddy giggle escaped her throat. She had just kissed the hell out of her high school crush, or rather her high school crush had just pinned her to the couch and all but stripped the lip gloss from her lips. Somewhere Chloe Bourgeois was undoubtedly having a conniption. "I think I understand the bow now," Adrian said, tilting his head to one side as he fluffed the bow a little. "I seem to remember there being quite a lot of birthdays where I didn't seem to get your gifts. Hard to send presents when you're all over the globe." Marinette laughed, resisting the urge to bite Adrian's buttons off and tear his shirt off with her teeth. "So you got me one big petite present," Adrian corrected, slowly pulling back to look at her curiously. "I wonder what it is." "Just don't shake it to guess," Marinette said, hands folding in front of herself as Adrian crossed his arms thoughtfully, slowly walking around the other side of her until he stood behind her. She turned her shoulders to look at him, but he simply turned her back the other way, hands lingering on her shoulders for a moment with a small squeeze. Do you want to open it?" Marinette asked, facing the wall opposite the couch as Adrian chuckled behind her. His eyes wandered up her nylon-covered legs, pausing at the bow on her waist before traveling up to the zipper expertly hidden under a seam in her dress. "I wonder what it could be," Adrian hummed, fingers slowly trailing up Marinette's back towards the zipper. "Is it something pink? No, you wouldn't wear pink with that shade of red, and you said it matched, He was dragging it out to watch her squirm. Marinette knew this for a fact as she took deep, calming breaths. Part of her wondered if he would guess correctly, while the other part of her wanted to take the dress off herself and get it over with. But she was still as Adrian tugged the zipper down a few inches, hand moving Marinette's loose hair over one shoulder. Inch by inch the zipper exposed more skin until Adrian spied something black and lacy with a delicate little bow where the clasp should have been. Marinette shivered more in anticipation than from the cold as Adrian said nothing behind her, moving the zipper down until it landed at the top of her waist at the end of its tract. "Seems I need a little help," Adrian chuckled in her ear. His lips pressed against the small of her neck as he pulled back. The sound of creaking couch springs behind her suggested he had sat back down. The back of her dress was open only enough to show the trail of skin between her neck and hips, broken only by a thin band of black lace around her midsection. You want me to finish unwrapping yourself?" Adrian said softly and calmly, as though he were asking her to pass him the remote control. She swallowed heavily, breathing through pursed lips as she grasped the bottom of her dress. And then she realized what position she was in, how things were bound to look from Adrian's position on the couch behind her once her dress cleared her hips. All they were missing were dim pink lights and a throbbing bass beat. And he must have thought himself so clever too. "Ooh, look at me, I'm Adrian Agreste, I'm a sexy supermodel, and I think Marinette will miss the fact that I all but asked her to shove her ass in my face," Marinette thought as she slid her arms out of her dress, rolling them forward and stretching languidly over the top of her head. Okay, smartass, you want a striptease, you got it. But remember, you asked for it. Something wrong? Adrian asked behind her as Marinette began humming something under her breath, softly at first as her hips swayed back and forth almost in time to the beat. It was a moment before he realized what the tune was as Marinette's thumbs hooked inside her dress and slowly pushed it down, inch by inch, as Adrian suddenly found himself in need of a cold glass of water. Happy birthday, dear Adrian, Marinette sang, pushing the dress down her calves, stepping out with a pair of heel clicks on the hardwood floor in front of him. Happy birthday, to you. She didn't have to turn around to know that the scant ensemble she was wearing had done its job. To be a designer meant knowing exactly how to flatter someone with clothing, to highlight their most attractive qualities and showcase their bodies in the best way possible. She knew her figure better than she knew most extended relatives, and if she was going to buy underwear for a date, she was going to make sure she looked better in it than she did without it. She was short, petite, and had athletic pear-shaped figure, so she wasn't going to wear plunging necklines and sheer baby dolls she might have suggested for Aaliyah. No, she needed something more minimalistic, and because Adrian had elected to be a teasing little smartass, he got a front row seat to Marinette bending over at the waist, hips swaying back and forth and humming happy birthday to him. This sight alone would have killed most mortal men and reduced those that survived to incompressible wrecks. It was only by the grace of God Adrian survived intact and mostly coherent. Marinette's hands clasped in front of her, tilting her head over her shoulder, and all but cackled at the dumbfounded expression of hungry awe on his face. Do you like your present? Marinette asked, turning around slowly to face him and giving him a clear view of her from the front. For the second time in less than 2 hours, Adrian found himself completely out of words and slowly looking Marinette up and down. His eyes glided over the black, sheer nylon stockings that he now saw ended mid-thigh, supported by a pair of straps on each side and hooked to a thin satin garter belt that rested on her hips. The belt seemed to meld with her underwear, which was a black and white lace thong that, which when viewed from behind highlighted her wonderfully squeezable-looking ass. Adrian's eyes wandered up, chuckling at the matching bra that was almost translucent and yet left everything except the top of her breasts to the imagination. In short, she was a monochrome wet dream from head to toe, blue eyes glinting up at him mischievously as he slowly got to his feet, hoping his excitement wasn't immediately visible to her. I love it, Adrian said after a moment, fingers reaching out and thumbing a satin strip on Marinette's bra. Lovely design, so well put together too. I can tell you put a lot of work into it. Thank you, but I actually bought these at a friend's boutique, Marinette said, biting her lip as Adrian's free hand toyed with the strap of her garter belt. I wasn't talking about your underwear, Adrian chuckled, back of his knuckles trailing down her hip as a small shudder passed through her body. She watched his appraising gaze take in every inch of her, raking over her exposed skin and making her feel more naked by his glance alone. He pressed his fingers to his lips thoughtfully and as a defense mechanism to stop himself from swooping down, kissing her full on the mouth, and taking her to bed, elaborate playdate be damned, slowly walking around her as if examining a particularly intriguing piece of art in a museum. What are you doing? Marinette chuckled, turning her head to look at Adrian, who simply palmed the top of her head and turned her back the other way. Ogling, Adrian said casually, pausing behind her with a small groan. The way the garter belt and stockings were structured, it looked as though Marinette had framed her backside in black lace and satin so that his eye was naturally drawn to it. Then again, Marinette had an ass that was impossible to ignore even if she had come dressed in full plate mail, so his eye was going to be drawn to it anyway. Then again, Adrian had spent the last 4 months trying his hardest not to stare at Marinette's butt as the weather warmed and she traded long pants for shorts, so now that he had tacit permission to do so, he was going to take full advantage of it. You make for quite the lovely sight, princess, Adrian said, stopping in front of her with a small, approving nod. I'm a lovely sight, Marinette said, hand pressed over her heart in feigned surprise. That's very forward of you, isn't it? Is that what passes for forward in your experience? Adrian said, closing the distance between them in a single step. Because if it is, I think we need to update your dictionary. Are you planning on giving me a grammar lesson? Marinette chuckled, shooting him a challenging look. To her surprise, the butterflies in her stomach were dissipating measure by measure, thanks largely in part to the barely veiled desire in Adrian's eyes. It was a look she had so rarely received before, not just lust but lust tempered with appreciation and more than a hint of playfulness. She didn't have time to feel self-conscious when every time he looked at her he looked like he wanted to pin her against the wall. She didn't have time to feel nervous when every pass of his hand sent shivers up her spine. In a manner of speaking, Adrian said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I've always been told that I'm a cunning linguist. And of course there was the fact that it was hard to be intimidated by someone who spouted lines like that. Are you now? Marinette snickered, hands behind her back as she stepped forward a little, leg stepping between his. Adrian glanced down with a mildly impressed look, returning her challenging gaze with one of his own. Well, I look forward to seeing your skilled tongue at work, sir. Adrian's teeth bared as he let out a small bark of laughter. Be careful what you ask for, princess. You just might get it. Oh no, Marinette whispered in a flat, pleading tone. Please, anything but that. You wouldn't be so cruel. Wouldn't I? Adrian said, tilting his head back and forth as he mentally bumped something from the evening's itinerary and replaced it with a much more appealing alternative. You don't know how cruel I can be. I'm begging you not to, Marinette whispered, lips curling into a smile and leaning into Adrian's touch as he cupped her face. Oh come on, Adrian said, leaning in and pressing a chaste kiss against Marinette's cheek. I think you can beg better than that. Marinette's breath hitched as he pulled back, hand trailing down her cheek and brushing over the lace choker still fastened around her neck. She should have known he would pick up on her choice of neckwear sooner or later. I've never seen you wear this before, Adrian said, snapping the elastic against her neck lightly. Never had the occasion to wear it, Marinette said, licking her lips. Until tonight, Adrian said with a teasing smile. Until tonight, Marinette said, lifting her chin so Adrian could get a better look at her little accessory. His finger slipped under the hem of the choker, tugging it forward experimentally with a thoughtful look on his face. She leaned into his touch, but the clasp at the back of the choker popped open, causing the entire thing to come off in one sharp tug. Pretty, Adrian said, clasping the choker together to make sure he didn't accidentally break it. But a little flimsy for what I had in mind. And what might that be? Marinette asked, rocking on her heels as Adrian dropped her choker on the table. Oh, wouldn't you like to know? Adrian chuckled. The urge to touch her again became overwhelming and he reached out, only to have Marinette take a small step back. A flash of unease washed through him until he saw the veiled, teasing glint in her eye that all but dared him to come and get her. Her heel sank into the rug as Adrian took a step forward. Smirking, she stepped back with her other leg, almost laughing when he mirrored her gesture, closing the distance between them yet again. If anyone looked in, they would have guessed that the pair were practicing a slow tango across the living room, save for the fact that one of them was in underwear that had more style than substance. Adrian took 2 steps forward and Marinette retreated until she felt the arm of the sofa press into her backside. She glanced back for a moment, almost reflexively, only to let out a small squeak of surprise when she turned around and nearly bumped her nose into Adrian's chest. Oops, Adrian pouted, hands slipping around her hips and holding her fast as she squirmed half-heartedly in his grip. Looks like you're done running. You don't think I could get away from you if I wanted to? Marinette giggled, pressing her hands against his chest with a light shove. No, Adrian said, lacing his fingers through hers and pushing back until she sat on the lip of the sofa. He brought her hands behind her back, holding them there as he leaned in closer. I just think you don't want to anymore. As laden with double meaning as that statement was, he wasn't saying anything Marinette didn't already know. She was tired of running away from him, tired of looking away from him like a blushing, stammering teenage girl who couldn't say 3 words to her crush without 2 of them being incomprehensible gibberish. She still felt a small waver in her stomach when he looked her, but she didn't look away because he asked her not to. Any self-sabotaging thoughts she might have had were squelched by the feeling of his hands firmly entwined with hers, confirmation that he didn't want her going anywhere without him. The illusion they had cultivated that she couldn't back away this time bolstered her nerve. As much as she teased him and played hard to get there was only one way she wanted that night to end. Adrian leaned in slowly and as Marinette opened her mouth to respond he seized her lips with another kiss, slower and tenderer than the scorcher he laid on her earlier but lacking none of the ferocity. Marinette wiggled against him, trying to get her hands under her and balance a little more so she didn't feel like she was going to tumble backwards while making out with him. After a few moments of shifting and squirming her lips tickled a little as Adrian laughed against them. Someone has ants in her pants, Adrian laughed, glancing down with a small shrug. Well, metaphorically speaking anyway. I feel like I'm going to fall back, Marinette said, pressing her forehead against his as her feet dangled in the air on either side of his hips. You won't, Adrian said softly, expression softening as his fingers squeezed hers a little harder. I got you. You sure? Marinette asked, biting her lip. You trust me? Adrian asked softly, looking up at her in a way that suggested that he wasn't just asking if she trusted him to stop her from falling back onto the couch. I do, Marinette murmured after a moment, eliciting a genuine smile from Adrian before he went back to kissing her. She leaned back a little, ankles crossing around his thighs as she willed herself to relax. I'm not going to fall, she reminded herself. Adrian was more than capable of supporting her weight, and even if he wasn't, she wasn't going to get hurt. So she closed her eyes, fingers flexing behind her back as she let Adrian deep in the kiss. To her surprise, the sensation of her arms being held behind her back, poised on the edge of falling backwards with only Adrian to support her, was more exciting than she thought it would be. Her hips pressed against his with a small whimper in the back of her throat, head swimming as she rocked against him feebly. Every instinct she had screamed at her to start tearing his clothes off, lace her fingers in his hair, strip until nothing but a thin strip of latex separated them. But he clearly wanted to move slower, which wasn't always a bad thing. Hey Adrian, Marinette gasped as his mouth pulled back from hers. Clearly not wanting his lips to be off her for more than a moment, Adrian's mouth dipped down and pressed against the side of her neck right above her collarbone. Her grip on his hands tightened, eyes and mouth popping open as the tips of Adrian's teeth lightly scraped across a patch of skin, nibbling on it in a way that made her clench her legs around his waist even tighter. Marinette's first conscious thought after her wits returned to her was that there was no way she was going to be able to cover up the mark Adrian was so intent on leaving on her neck. Her dress plunged so low that he could have started leaving hickeys on her breasts and she still wouldn't have been able to cover it up. Her second thought was that Adrian could cover her neck in love bites and she would have asked for more. The soft, suckling pressure of his lips combined with the gentle bites he pressed into her neck in alternating intervals made her toes curl inside her heels as she strained up against him, tilting her head back to give him better access to her neck. As he kissed her, one hand untangled from hers to support her waist. He disengaged from her neck, leaving it pink, wet, and aching, and pressed his mouth against hers again, other hand cupping the back of her head. She moaned into the kiss, hands wrapping around his shoulders until Adrian pulled back with a throaty chuckle. He chided, lips curling into a devilish smirk as Marinette frowned in confusion. Hands behind your back, princess. Marinette let out a small whimper, but the glint in his eyes brooked no disagreement. Tossing her hair out of her eyes, she let her hands fall from his shoulders, dangling behind her until they gripped the corners of a pillow on the couch. Thank you, Adrian said, glancing down as both hands moved to support her hips. The way she was positioned, it was impossible for him to avoid her chest and his face, not that he wanted to in the first place. Marinette glanced up at him, flushing under his gaze as he leaned down to press a kiss against her collarbone. What are you MMNH? Marinette whimpered as Adrian's lips trailed lower, lingering between her breasts for a moment as green eyes flicked up to meet her. Shish, he shushed her softly, teeth grazing over the crest of her right breast and eliciting a squeak out of her. You will see. Before she could say anything else, Adrian's mouth dipped down and captured the small bow between her breasts, hiding the clasp that her bra together from the front. Her stomach churned as she watched the fabric disappear into his mouth, watching his tongue swirl around in his mouth for a moment. She knew the lingerie she picked out was designed for easy access, but she doubted Adrian would be able to undo the clasp with just his snap tongue. Marinette's mouth hung open as the clasp fell out of his mouth, landing on her chest with a pair of wet thumps as Adrian grinned up at her, looking exceptionally pleased with himself. His tongue flitted out of his mouth, slowly licking his lips as though he were about to feast on her. Told you, Adrian said, pulling her upright on the edge of the couch as her bra slid down her back. Instinctively, Marinette's hands covered her suddenly exposed chest, eliciting a small chuckle from Adrian. I did tell you to keep your hands behind your back, didn't I? Adrian said, hands resting on the tops of her thighs as she fought the flaming flush that threatened to overwhelm her face. She was never the type to get insecure about her cup size, but faced with the prospect of being suddenly topless before her high school crush was enough to give her the smallest bit of pause. With a deep, shuddering breath, Marinette's hands dropped to her stomach, sliding behind her back in a way that offered her breasts for Adrian's inspection. Suffice to say, the sight of topless, panting, blushing Scarlet Marinette perched on his couch, looking up at him as her legs spread underneath his touch, was a sight Adrian wasn't adequately prepared for. Try as he might to conceal the sensation of unrestrained glee welling up inside him, something on his face must have given him away, because Marinette let a small giggle slip out of her throat, hands resting behind her back on the couch as she looked up at him shyly. Are you looking at me like that because you like the sight of me half naked, or are you looking at me like that because you like it when I'm embarrassed? Marinette snorted, stomach tightening as his hands started slowly sliding up her hips. I like both, Adrian said, leaning in and pressing a soft kiss against Marinette's lips. But while the sight of you naked is never going to get old, Marinette sucked in breath as his hands slid up to cup her breasts, giving them a light squeeze, arching into his touch as his lips pulled back from hers. You're only going to be this embarrassed in front of me for so long, Adrian murmured, chuckling at the small whimper that escaped her lips, head dipped and pressed against his chest as his fingers so expertly fondled hers. I find that really hard to believe, sir, Marinette panted, leaning up and pressing her lips against the soft linen of Adrian's shirt as he lightly pinched her nipples between his fingers. The sharp sensation jolted her enough that her hands instinctively came up, clutching the back of his hands with a small moan. There was a beat before Marinette looked down at her own hands, then back up at Adrian, who had a teasing smile on his face. Oh, Marinette chuckled, slipping her hands behind her back again. Sorry. You need some help keeping your hands where they belong? Adrian asked, slipping his hands off her breasts and tilting her chin up in the way that made her stomach flutter at the implication. Oh hell yes, Marinette purred instinctively, blushing as Adrian suppressed a small snicker. Now who's being forward? Adrian said, sliding his hands down her sides and lightly squeezing the top of her thighs. Sorry, Marinette chuckled before adopting what she hoped was a demure expression, lip between her teeth and looking up at him shyly between her eyelashes. It's just, I don't know if I can trust myself to keep my hands off you anymore, sir. It was a sentiment Adrian could sympathize with. Not because he thought himself to be that untouchable, but because he had maintained almost constant contact with her since her dress came off and wasn't about to let up anytime soon. God knew that he would have to be cuffed and roped to keep his hands off her, and even then it would be a Herculean task. He was fast becoming addicted to the way her soft, pale, lightly freckled skin felt under his fingers, how she seemed to lean into every touch as though she wanted as much of his hands on her as possible. Well, if that was how she wanted it. Marinette followed Adrian's gaze as he glanced at a polished black wooden box on the coffee table that had gone unnoticed by her until then. She had assumed that it was purely decorative, but the way that Adrian was looking at it suggested it had something important in. Eep. Before Marinette could speculate any further, she found herself lifted into the air, letting out a small squeak as Adrian scooped her off the couch as though she were a throw pillow and started carrying her across the living room towards a plush linen chair opposite the full-length mirror she had eyed him in earlier. While she had never necessarily enjoyed being a fun-sized person, she had to admit it had its advantages, namely that her boyfriend's partners could pick her up with little effort, which always made for interesting opportunities. She wrapped her legs around his waist almost reflexively, heels slipping off her feet and clacking against the ground as Adrian deposited her on the ottoman in front of the chair, entangling her legs from him as a giggle bubbled up from her throat. Stay, Adrian said, leaning in and pressing her shoulders against the ottoman before pressing another kiss against her lips. I'll be right back. Don't be too long, Marinette murmured, hands folding over her chest as Adrian left. She watched him bend over to pick up her shoes and dress, letting out a small approving groan that was loud enough to draw Adrian's attention back in her direction. She flattened back against the ottoman before he turned around, staring at the ceiling above her with an innocent expression on her face as Adrian shook his head and disappeared towards the hall closet. As his footsteps headed towards the front, Marinette found herself alone for the first time in almost an hour. A casual glance to her side and she caught her reflection in the mirror, leaning back on the ottoman dressed only in her panties and socks as her hands draped over her breasts. Her reflection's cheeks pinked as her legs rose to perch on the ottoman beneath her. She didn't know where Adrian was going, but she knew that when he came back they were going to do more than just make out on the couch like a pair of horny teenagers. Beyond that, she had no idea what the night held for her, which just made the experience all the more arousing. Adrian's hands roaming her body had done more than enough to warm her up as her hand drifted lazily down her stomach, eyes closing as her fingers brushed the front of her underwear with a small whine. Her clit throbbed as the damp lace pressed against it, hips rising to meet her touch. Adrian was still rummaging around in the hall closet, so Marinette took a moment to stoke the fire building inside her. Her fingers slipped under the waistband of her panties briefly, mouth opening as her fingers toyed with her aching sex lazily, just enough to remind her of why she had gone there that night. Images of leather, chains, and soft nylon rope filled her head as her fingers worked a steady circle around her clit, free hand lightly squeezing her breast. She wondered if she was close enough to come. She didn't know how long she was going to last once Adrian got his hands on her, and she didn't want to look like a total virgin in front of him. Once Adrian got his hands on her, and she didn't want to look like a total virgin in front of him. Eye-opening surreptitiously towards the hall, she saw no sign of Adrian, and so she fell back against the ottoman, strokes becoming more insistent as she imagined Adrian's fingers in her hair, his hands gripping her shoulders as he drove into her again and again. She imagined a rough slap on her bottom waking her from the lusty haze as her hips jerked against her fingers. A little more and she would be there. Her fantasies became more insistent, visions of Adrian swathed in black leather, crop dangling lightly from his hand, lips biting and sucking and kissing at her neck, her breasts, any spare patch of skin they could reach. Eyes scrunched up, Marinette could feel herself peeking with only a few, scant strokes separating her from enjoying yourself, princess. Chapter end notes. Please direct all hate mail to the hashtag sidereal sandman tag on Tumblr. I promise you I'm not doing this because I enjoy dangling the promise of smut and taking it away. I was looking at the chapter and I realized a lot happens in this chapter and a lot more happens in the next chapter, and if I put them all in one chapter it would be kinda busy. It would be a wall of smut and character building that would take most people a few days to read and probably wouldn't have gotten out until May. I mean, you would have had to wait another week or so anyway, so I thought I should break up the chapter here just so there wouldn't be so much time between updates. And so you could start reading this instead of waiting for the whole goddamn thing. Thanks a million to Tumblr user Pardonmo for doing a bang-up job on betaing this chapter and giving me some pointers on how to make it better than it was. Next time we have a smutload of smut. More smut than you I what to do with. At least 3 separate smut scenes that serve as coronation scenes punctuated with a DTR conversation that sets us up for all kinds of fun relationship stuff. We're coming up on the end of part 1 of 3 for this FIC, and sweet Jesus, I think I'm running out of cat puns. I need to switch up my chapter naming. Our chapter 23 is going to be called Catwings or something. ... Catwings. Anyone remember that? Books with the cats with the wings. No. Cats